I wanted to share part of a lecture that I put together for the students of my Introduction to Native American Studies course over this past weekend. The unit that we're dealing with pertains to the history of Indian policy in Canada, right from the Royal Proclamation all the way through to current day. And reviewing the chapter in our reader, I felt like the students needed some localized, on-the-ground level examples of how these policies were actually instituted in particular communities to really appreciate the obstacles that Canadian First Nations communities were up against during certain periods of this history. I was especially interested in talking to them about the era from around 1890 to 1920. The reason I wanted to deal with this era in particular was because for the Blood Tribe, Gana community, which I'm most familiar with, this era was well documented. Some of the ways that these policies were implemented were well documented by a former Indian agent, R.N. Wilson. Some of the corruption that existed in the Indian Department and the way that the community was taken advantage of. He wrote a paper submitted to the federal government at the time that was called Our Betrayed Wards that really detailed some of the abuse that went on the Blood Reserve. And I thought this would be a great example to share with the students and to really demonstrate how insidious these policy implementations were in that era. And not that anything has changed drastically. I mean, I suppose that one could claim that it has, but there are still residues of all of what I'm going to talk about going on in terms of the management of First Nations. So the era that I want to deal with here, and a lot of this comes out of R.N. Wilson's Our Betrayed Wards, but some of it also is going to come from my own exposure to the oral tradition of the Blood Tribe and reference to other resources and such that I've read in the past. Just to give kind of an overview, this is an era when the Indian Act is being applied in a certain manner. And one of the players at the federal level who's involved with this is Duncan Campbell Scott, whose name I remember quite well over the years that I worked with the late Narcissus Blood and the late Marie Smallface Maruli. They both talked about Duncan Campbell Scott very often in their reference to the way that the Indian Department would abuse the community. Duncan Campbell Scott really wanted to see First Nations communities not dependent on the government. He was an advocate of intermarriage as a way to take away people's Indian status, basically. In the Indian Act, which was the legislation passed in 1776, governing the management of Canadian relations with First Nations. In the Indian Act, one of the things, one of the three kind of areas that it focused on was the ending of Indian status by way of intermarriage through the women, really. If a First Nations woman married outside of her tribe, if she married into a man from another tribe, she had to take status with that tribe instead of her home tribe. If she married a non-native, she lost her status altogether. and this happened quite often. So this is one of the things that he advocated. He also was the guy who was really at the forefront of pushing the agenda with the ecclesiastic residential schools. I think the residential school population rose by about 51%, the number of students that were in residential schools during Duncan Campbell Scott's term. And he managed Indian affairs in a really heavy-handed way. I think he employed upward of 600 different Indian agents who were assigned to different reserves. And he insisted on their absolute loyalty to the decisions that were handed down to them through his office. Now, he didn't act alone. He acted in tandem with the superintendent at that time, who was Arthur Meighan. And Arthur Meighan became superintendent in 1917, and you're going to see how that changes things for the Blood tribe. This guy, 3 years later, would become the Prime Minister of Canada. But in 1917, he was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, and Duncan Campbell Scott had already been working in Indian Affairs for 4 years prior to that as the Assistant Superintendent. So when they got in, their heavy-handed manner of implementing the Indian Act really had a strong effect on the Blood tribe community and other communities, but with Ghana, it's very well documented, so it serves as a good case study. And I think one of the reasons that this is very important, this history is very important to remember and share and discuss, is because some of the residues that still carry from this in the general Canadian population is there's a kind of a popular discourse that portrays First Nations people as once having moved onto reserve and onto the reserves as being just completely reliant, dependent on the government and government assistance. As you can see, that's not the case, and it's a myth that continues today, and it continues to be perpetuated as part of an institutionalized racism within the country of Canada, and is expressed most vehemently at the local level, especially near large reserves, like here where I live in Lethbridge, Alberta. You hear this discourse quite a bit, and people don't really know the actual history of the Blood tribe's attempts to participate in the mainstream economy and the way that their participation has been sabotaged by guys like this. So let's go back to the late 1800s. You know, the Indian Act was put in place in 1776. This is a year prior to the Blackfoot tribes signing off on Treaty 7, which, by the way, they didn't understand in the same terms as the Treaty Commission. They didn't understand it as a ceding of land. But in any case, you see that there's a policy in place to manage the tribes and the relationships with the tribes before there's even a formal agreement with the tribes, right, through the treaty. On the left here is Red Crow. He was one of the main treaty signatories, along with Crowfoot and several other Blackfoot, Stoney, and Sarcee leaders. On the right is his adopted son, Cropbeard Wolf, who's going to figure into the story that I want to tell here fairly prominently. Cropbeard Wolf's older sister, was married to Red Crow, and Cropbeard Wolf was orphaned, and so being married to his older sister, Red Crow took him in as an adopted son, and he became a very favored son, such that when Red Crow eventually passed away in 1900, he handed the reins over leadership of Blood Tribe to Cropbeard Wolf. Now, both of these guys were around in the era when there was still a lot of intertribal fighting, and that a lot of that fighting, of course, is due to the pressures of settlers moving ever more west and creating a situation where tribal territories were basically being invaded and lands being stolen and people being displaced. And Blackfoot country was kind of one of the last bastions of real native culture on the Western Plains. The Blackfoot had a very strong military and were able to hold off the intrusions for quite a while. In fact, you might hear about guys like Chief Joseph or Sitting Bull and their fights with the U.S. Army, and where they ran during those fights was they ran toward Blackfoot territory to hopefully ally up with the Blackfoot tribes. So Blackfoot had a strong military, and both of these guys engaged in that. And Red Crow was really, before he became kind of a leader of the Fish Eaters clan, Mamioiks, he came to be in that position through, I think, a lot of his war exploits. Cropbeard Wolf as well participated. In 1865, the two of them went to war against the Cree, and they were trying to avenge Sarcee chief Little Drum, who was the brother of Bullhead, who had been killed by the Cree, who were an ally of the Blackfoot tribes. And so Red Crow and Cropbeard Wolf and others went to go seek revenge against the Cree. And in the process, Cropbeard Wolf was shot in his leg, and he ended up having a limp for the rest of his life. He wasn't as fully mobile as he was before. And after that incident, he kind of settled down a bit and focused on raising horses. And he became well known for having a large horse herd. In fact, when he got transferred, Misamach gwin him on the long time pipe sometime later, he paid 100 horses for the transfer of a medicine bundle to take care of. So he was very wealthy in horses, well known for it. 1877, Treaty 7 is signed. At the time, there's still some bison on the plains. And so after dealing with the Treaty Commission, the Blackfoot tribes did not just go settle down onto the reserves that were defined for them through the treaty. I remember the late Frank Weaselhead telling me that that Red Crow in particular, he just said, "I'm going home," and which was down to the current day area of the Blood Reserve. And he was the leader of Mamioiks, the Fish Eaters. And when he went home, 62 families followed him. And these were families from several different clans, but in a way they all became followers of Red Crow, and in a sense an amalgamation of the Fish Eaters into this tribe of Gana. Not that the tribe didn't exist before, but people living in such close proximity didn't happen before. But they still had the relative freedom, right? They could come and go and move around the territory, all they wanted, and they did until the actual demise of the bison. which occurred, I think the last Blackfoot bison hunt, I believe, occurred in 1883. And that same year is when the realization hit home that they needed assistance from the government. They needed to request rations, food rations, because they were faced with starvation. The main food source, the bison, had been exterminated in a military effort to subdue the tribes, right? So 1883, they really settled down on the blood reserve, and in fact, another treaty is signed, and the area defining the blood reserve is mapped out and surveyed and such. In 1884, that following year, Red Crow and Crop-eared Wolf start the first farm on the reserve. They start a 60-acre farm where they're growing vegetables and keeping vegetables in root houses and sharing it with the rest of the people. They're trying to feed the band members. 10 years later, and they continue this for the next decade, only 10 years later do they start thinking about getting into cattle ranching. They have lots of horses, the old war ponies and such. And so Red Crow, Crop-eared Wolf, and two others all contribute 15 horses, 15 ponies each, to purchase an equal number of heifers, female cows. So they, in total, they start a cattle herd of 60 cows, right? And then in 1900, as I said before, Red Crow passes away, and he leaves the leadership of the tribe in the hands of Crop-eared Wolf, who continues along this vein. And really, because of his efforts to adapt, I mean, this is one of the things that Red Crow has become really well known for in the community, is that he's famous not just for being a renowned leader at the time, but really for looking at the future and saying, okay, we need to shift things up and adopt some of these other practices like farming and ranching. We'll do it our way. We'll do it in a kind of a collective, collectively owned, blood tribe way of doing things. But we do need to adapt because the bison are gone, right? And so he begins making those moves. So as soon as they're on the reserve permanently in 1883, 1884, they've already got their first farm. 10 years later, they've got the starts of a cattle herd. Through this time, of course, people are still basically starving. This is the ration house. I think this is the ration house that was down in what's now the Farm 4 area of the Blood Reserve. The foundation for this building is still down there. And this is where the government would give rations of meat and flour and sugar and this kind of thing to households. Not a lot, but enough to barely keep them from starving to death. And one of the things that you see happen during this era is something that I've come to know through my repatriation work as a salvage paradigm throughout North America. And what I mean by this is that in the popular discourse as well as in the official discourse of the time, there was this notion that the tribes were going to disappear, right? That they were going to basically vanish. They'll either intermarry and just become part of the regular citizenship, the populace. Some would be passing away, but in any case, like, there wasn't a long-term vision for the tribes, and so a big effort went forward, both among ethnographers, anthropologists who were just starting to form their discipline formally within some of the American universities. Among anthropologists, ethnographers, and lay people, collectors, they moved into the First Nations communities and began buying up as much material culture as they could and collecting as many stories, oral traditions, and this as they could, right? So there's a lot of materials that were collected in that era. And in part, I look at that history as something that ultimately was beneficial, although at the time it wasn't so, because we can now turn back to those records and see what it was that the leadership and the elders of the time wanted to save and have documented for future generations. But there's still a lot of the residues of this era that are basically being held hostage in collection institutions. This photograph here is the late Frank Weaselhead. I took this photograph when we were at it might have been me, it might have been my wife who took this photograph. I think it was probably her. I think I was doing video at the time. But we were at the British Museum some years back. And this shirt is Red Crow's shirt. And it was acquired, I believe, by the fellow who was running the ration house on the Blood Reserve at the time. I forget the guy's name. But he would give people rations, and if they wanted extra, they had to trade him for it, and they'd bring in materials, from their households, valuable material culture that they would trade just for food, for subsistence, right? And this collection ended up being split. Part of it's in the British Museum, part of it's at the Royal Ontario Museum. Some years, maybe a decade or more back, there were the people working in those museums partnered up with the Govt Museum here in Lethbridge, Alberta, and brought the collection over here so that people could see these things. And they're all very well, the guy who was collecting them from the ration house kept very good documentation about which item belonged to who and this kind of a thing. And so people were able to see some of their ancestral heirlooms for a brief period. But then they were sent back to the UK and Toronto, which doesn't make any sense, but this is part of the ongoing thing, right? This era, the residues of this era, like I said, are not over. There's still injustices going on. So this is part of it. People were starving, right? People were starving, and they were being taken advantage of in that situation by some of the agents who were working on behalf of Indian affairs and such. Crop-eared wolf, Red Crow, the leadership of Blood Tribe, they wanted self-sufficiency for the tribe. They didn't want to continue like this, where people are starving and destitute. So this is what getting into the agricultural business is all about, trying to put an end to this. As soon as Red Crow passed away, there was a strong push from neighboring communities, in particular Cardston, to open the reserve to white settlement. And I read the journals of Charles Card, and so I appreciate that he had a fairly respectful relationship with Red Crow prior to Red Crow's passing away. At the same time, it doesn't surprise me that as soon as Red Crow's out of the picture, the attitude changes, and there's this push to open the reserve, which of course the Blood Tribe resisted. Crop-eared wolf wasn't gonna do that, wasn't gonna allow that, and so the Indian agent, who was R.N. Wilson at that time, in 1907, forced a vote for the sale of 2,400 acres on the south end of the reserve. And so Blood Tribe members came and voted, and they voted it down. and R.N. Wilson was upset. I think he wanted to assuage the Cardston settlers, but he said basically that Makoyopistoki, the crop-eared wolf, had went door to door among his fellow tribal members and petitioned them to vote down the land sale, which they did. So they refused to sell, and instead of selling in 1907, they used some of their money from their ranching business to purchase the first steam engine farming tractor for the reserve. And the purchase of this steam engine actually put them ahead of a lot of the non-Indian farmers and ranchers in the region. They paid about $10,000 for it, I believe, and they got most of that money off of a lease. R.N. Wilson had brokered a lease for a guy named McEwan to bring cattle onto the reserve, and I think it started off with just a few thousand cattle that McEwan had brought onto the reserve, but by 1907 or so, I believe he had brought in something close to 10,000 cattle, and was paying $1 a year for them to graze on the Blood Reserve. And so Blood Tribe had been pooling this money, and they used it to purchase this steam plow, right? So this put them ahead. This gave them an upper hand in their farming activities, and so they put it to use, right? As things went along, Crop-eared Wolf himself eventually passed away. He handed on the leadership of the tribe to his son, Shot Both Sides. This is Chief Shot Both Sides in 1913. And Shot Both Sides continued with the same vision that Red Crow and Crop-eared Wolf had to lead Blood Tribe into further and further agricultural business. So moving on toward the era when we see, 1913 is when Duncan Campbell Scott comes into the Department of Indian Affairs, and 1917 is when Arthur Meighen, later to become Prime Minister, becomes the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And so keep that date in mind, 1917, because that's where we're going now. So by 1917, the Blood Tribe owns in total about 4,000 head of cattle, about 3,600 head of horses. Their annual beef production is $60,000. They're still leasing to McEwan. He's got 10,000 head of cattle on their land. He's paying them $10,000 a year for it. They're doing pretty good in the ranching business. On the other side of their business, in growing crops, same year, they harvested 65,000 bushels of wheat, 27,000 bushels of oats, 7,000 bushels of table vegetables, 8,000 tons of hay. So at this point, Blood Tribe is able to help themselves, right? They're no longer dependent on the government. They've built their own business with their own money, and they're succeeding. On top of that, the part of why the cattle herds had grown was because the government did, for several years, offer grants, in a sense, loans of cattle. So if a young guy out of school wanted to start up his own herd, or wanted to purchase some cattle so that he could participate in the ranching business of the tribe, the government would give him 5 heifers with the understanding that in the future he would have to give 5 heifers back. So it wasn't a handout that got the tribe started in this business. It started with a purchase made by the 4 guys who bought the first 60 cattle, and then built up somewhat with the government loans of heifers that were paid back, and then, just regular cattle operations, growing the herd, right? So Blood Tribe was doing good, and they were doing it on their own. This wasn't again, we still have this in the discourse, this idea that, since the beginning of the reservation eras, the Canadian people have just been taking care of the tribes. It's not the case at all. All the way along, the tribes have been using their own funds from their own businesses to run their operations. Aside from the brief period where there were rations being given out because the government had purposely starved the people into that situation, right? So 1917, okay, we got a new superintendent of Indian Affairs. We've got a guy, second in command, who's very heavy-handed, wanting to eventually disintegrate the First Nations or have them just become part of the regular Canadian populace. And you also have the end of World War I, and you have returning soldiers. This is a group of 9 Blood Tribe members who went to World War I. I don't know all of their names. I think the guy on the top row, far left-hand side, I believe that's George Cummingsinger, who did not return. He was killed over there. I think the guy on the far right side of the top row was killed as well. They lost 2 guys. On the bottom row, I know the guy on the far left is Nick King. The guy on the far right is Mike Mountain Horse. And standing next to Mike Mountain Horse is another Mountain Horse. I forget his name. But point is, Blood Tribe sent soldiers to World War I. They sent soldiers. And some good stories that come out of that, hey? Nick King, for example. Nick King, and this is my understanding of the story, the way it went. My understanding was Nick King was the son-in-law of Bonakaxiksin on the White Elk, and that when he was going to go to war, he went to visit his father-in-law and was transferred this headdress and the suit that goes with it, which is called Nitukekimska, which is the one-horned water serpent's outfit. And this was something that would have been worn to war during the intertribal wars during that era. And so it was transferred to Nick to bring with him to World War I as a protection. So Nick and the other boys shipped off to England to train, and they were going to deploy into France. And while they were in their training in England, he realized that this might not be the best, the safest outfit to be wearing to war in the modern warfare era, right? So he talks to his commanding officer, who's from England, and asks whether there's a possibility that he can leave these things with that guy's family in England. And I think he agreed that in exchange, if he allowed him to keep it there while they were deployed to France and pick him up later, he would allow the family to keep the leggings and moccasins, where he would take the headdress and the jacket and this back home. So the guy and his family agreed, and that's what happened. And Nick and the boys went off to France to fight, but they never went back to England. They went directly back to Canada from France, and so he was never able to pick up this headdress. And for a while, I was actually searching for this. as a lost bundle that needed repatriating. I found out that the family home of his commanding officer was on a street that had been bombed into oblivion during World War II, and had no idea ultimately where this outfit went. There was some communication from, I believe, R.N. Wilson, or one of the Indian agents at the time. Yeah, it wouldn't have been R.N. Wilson, but it went back and forth. And only recently did I see a picture of Nick wearing this outfit back at Blood Tribe again. So I do believe that this at some point came back, but now I don't know where it is. In any case, when Nick first came back from the war, he didn't have it with him. But what he did have with him was a German helmet that had a spike on it from an enemy that he'd killed. And so when he went to visit his father-in-law, this is what he gave him. And his father-in-law, White Elk, I believe he said he was going to join the Horn Society and change his name to reflect this war deed and call himself from then on Sochskinny, which is Heavyhead. This is the origin of the name Heavyhead. So there's stories like that come out of this, but Blood Tribe participated in World War I and all World War II and Vietnam and everything, right? So most guys, when they returned from the war in 1917, they returned to a situation where they could take advantage of something called the Soldier Settlement Act. The Soldier Settlement Act gave every veteran opportunity to be given a quarter section of land in Canada and $2,500 to start up some kind of business on that land, whether it be agriculture or what have you. The native guys coming back were not given the opportunity to take advantage of this act. First Nations people in that time still weren't even considered Canadian citizens, not until 1960. Does that really happen? So they came back, and this was going on. They couldn't take advantage of it. Worse still, what the Indian Department wanted to do, and what the Indian agents were ordered to do, was basically get the tribes to vote for sales of large portions of the reserve. And it was those lands from the reserves that would be given to these returning World War I soldiers, right? And so this happens at all of the Blackfeet, in all of the Canadian Blackfeet communities. At Blood Tribe, the vote that was pushed for this land sale was they were asked to sell 90,000 acres of the reserve, which is a huge, huge portion. Beat Gunny Tribe and Siksika Tribe were both pushed to sell portions of their reserve too, and they did. But with Blood Tribe, the vote went through, and after everything was counted and such, it was announced that the tribe was in favor of the sale. But Chief shot both sides, didn't buy it. So he immediately petitioned Ottawa. He said something's wrong, and he investigated, and it was found that a lot of the votes were cast by people who had been passed away for some time and people who were not of age. And so, basically it had been a fraudulent vote. It had been falsified. The Blood Tribe was the Indian agent had attempted to steal 90,000 acres on order from the higher ups, from the department. So this is what was going on, and R.N. Wilson, when he writes about it later in Our Betrayed Wards, I think it's worth just reading this little passage. He says, the head chief, representing the true majority of the tribe, at once filed at Ottawa charges of fraud, bribery, and intimidation, and requested the department not to accept the surrender without an investigation of his charges, following which protest no further action was taken by the department with the document, and it was not sent up to the council for acceptance. Any attempt here to give an adequate description of the compulsion that was exerted upon the Bloods in this surrender campaign of 1917 to 18 would require more space than we have at our disposal for this memorandum, but a few illustrations will serve to show the dangers to which Indians are exposed when a government official considers that it is up to him to secure land from them by hook or crook. And mind, this is being written by an ex-Blood Tribe Indian agent. So it's quite believable. He knows what goes on from the inside, and he witnessed all of this happening at the time. So Blood Tribe refuses the vote, and there are repercussions for this. This is what he's talking about. This the compulsion that becomes exerted upon the people. So this pressure comes in various forms. One of the realities of the time is that there were no banks available for the tribe or the members of the tribe, right? And so when you had money that needed to be deposited in a bank for safekeeping, what they would do was they would deposit it with the Indian agent at the Blood Tribe Agency, this building here. These are personal funds as well as tribal funds. And after the vote, what happens is that those members who had a stake in the cattle business or in the agriculture and had some money accrued and had deposited it here were not allowed to withdraw it anymore. And in fact, those people who had voted in favor of the sale could approach the agent and receive loans from these funds, from their fellow tribal members' actual personal holdings, right? So this is one of the ways that that pressure is strongly exerted on the tribal members. You basically, if you voted against the land sale, you were blacklisted by the agency, and he was going to put an end to your business and to your ability to use the money you had acquired previously. Okay. That same year, 1918, the government comes out with a new program they're calling Greater Production. And this is a push that occurs on all the Indian reserves, where the premise is that the reserve lands are not being adequately used for production, and so it needs to increase by leasing sections of the reserves off to non-native people to make better use of. So this is the next step, greater production. And the first application of that came in a proposal that the Blood Tribe lease 6,000 acres on the south end of its reserve by Cardston. And the people were told that if they agreed to this, they would be promised $25 or $24 a year for each household in payment during the lease period. And any hay that was grown on the lease would be cut and stored for winter feed for the Blood Tribe's livestock. So everybody gets $24 a year, well, every household does, and the tribe gets hay to feed their livestock out of this deal. And Shot Both Sides is not, he's not interested in fighting with the government. He wants to have good relations. And so hearing this deal, he advocates for it, and the tribe votes in favor of doing this lease. However, they want some money up front, a portion of the $24 at least up front. And so the agency has each male head of household come in on a given day and receive $6 and sign for it. And when at the end of the day, when all is said and done, shop both sides takes the document that all of these men have signed, brings it to an interpreter, and finds out that the entire arrangement for the lease has been changed in the wording of this document. They'll no longer be receiving any hay for their livestock. They'll no longer be receiving an annual payment of $24 a year. That $6 is the sum total payment for them for that year, and in subsequent years, they would get $6 for each household. So they basically used the fact that nobody knew English and could read English yet to swindle the tribe into signing off on a bogus deal. So everybody was going to get $6 instead of $24, and even at that, the government didn't want to give it. And this is how insidious things get. The following year, when people are expecting to receive their next $6 payment, the agent brings in an individual, a man with a rifle, who goes door to door to each household of the Blood Reserve and announces that there's a new dog tax on the reserve that's going to be instituted by the agent, and that if a family owns any dogs, they are to pay $6 a year to keep those dogs, which can be, signed away directly from the lease payment, rather than having to actually fork up the money. If somebody does not want to sign their $6 over or pay their dog tax, then this man with the rifle will shoot all their dogs. So this is how they were rolling. Okay, it's really terrorism. It's so oppressive. But this is what was happening, right? So people are being just forced into these situations where they were getting nothing for the deals that the Indian agent was making. That was the 6,000 acre lease. There was also that same year a 9,000 acre lease, and this one the Indian agent just brokered without any vote. He just decided that he was going to lease out 90,000 acres of the reserve, 50,000 acres at the north end, and 40,000 acres at the south end. And anybody who was a tribal member who was living or had homes or farmlands in those areas that they'd been working for the last 2 decades needed to move out, needed to pack up and get out of there, because there were white non-native ranchers who were allowed in to bring their livestock, and they brought horse, they brought cattle, they brought especially a lot of sheep, and they started grazing. They fenced off those areas of the reserve so that the native livestock, who are now, sequestered basically in the middle of the reserve, could not come into the short grass area at the north end or the long grass area at the south end. It used to be, I guess, that they would, the annual round would be basically in the summer, you would graze on the north end in the short grass prairies and then move their livestock down to the south end where there's a lot more resources in the long grass for the winter. But they were cut off of those areas. They were left to graze in the middle of the reserve, and these lessees who were being brought in were being allowed to graze outside of their 90-acre lease as well. They were allowed to graze their animals anywhere on the reserve, but the 90,000 acres was fenced off and exclusively for them. And people were being forced to move, like I said. When the tribe began to complain, the Indian agent brought in armed guards to basically stand around like soldiers, so that people knew that, oh yeah, if you really want to complain, we're going to force this situation. So things were getting ugly. Going into the spring of 1919, the Indian agent refused to allow the tribe to hold its annual roundup. Well, they used to do 2 roundups a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. The spring roundup is extremely important because the tribe was using a range herd system, which meant that all of the cattle were out on the land together. And so people would, depending on the number of cattle you had to put forward so much hay for the winter and that kind of thing. And if you could work the cattle, you would work them. But a lot of cattle were owned by, widows and others who couldn't necessarily work them. But it worked out with the range herd system because they were all together, right? And so at the spring roundup, what you have is you have the branding of everybody's calves that were born that year. And at this time of the year, the calves would be following close to their mothers, and so you could go by the mother's brand to know who owned which calves, and you could brand those. By not allowing the spring roundup, by fall time, by the next roundup, it meant that the calves would not be following their mothers anymore, and nobody would know whose calves are whose. Right? So this is screwing up their system big time by not allowing this roundup. Not only that, but the Indian agent said, we're not going to allow the range herd system altogether anymore. If you want to have cattle, you have to have them at your home, you have to have them in your corral, and this was a problem for a lot of people. Like I said, not everybody could actually work the cattle. And nobody had the resources to be building all those fences and this kind of a thing to make that an actuality. The bigger, as if this wasn't enough, the most scary proposition was that because of the extreme loss of feed due to the leases and all of these other animals being brought onto the reserve, because of this, by June 1919, everybody knew that there wasn't going to be enough food going into winter for the livestock, right? So the Indian agent and shot both sides both start petitioning the department, the federal government, Ottawa, to either move the lessee's animals off of the reserve or supply some additional winter feed. And these requests were completely ignored by the Indian Department. There was no feedback given. They were just supposed to move forward, business as usual. So they knew that it was going to be a problem going into the winter. And so the Indian agent, as winter commenced, decided that he was going to move 1,000 head of the blood tribe cattle. And this is the blood tribe, they had close to 4,000 cattle at the time. He's going to take 1,000 of them and move them off of the reserve. So he sold, first of all, he had them rounded up, that 1,000 head, and corralled. And he had that done weeks before they had arranged to actually ship them anywhere. And during those weeks that they were corralled, they were being fed the winter feed, the very little amount of winter feed that they had set aside for the livestock, right? So they were using up winter feed needlessly. There was still lots of, available free-range food for these animals, but they penned them in, and they were using up what little food that they had for several weeks. And then 600 of them were shipped to Moose Jaw in a sale which the Indian agent brokered for 5 cents a head. And that was half the going price that year for cattle. So he sold 600 of the blood tribe's cattle at a loss, a huge loss, and made the blood tribe pay for the rail costs of shipping them to Moose Jaw. The other 400 were shipped to the Stoney Reserve at blood tribe expense, and they were going to be brought back the following summer. But en route, they decided to dip the cattle to make sure that they didn't have any parasites and such. And this is winter time. This is below 0 temperatures, such that by the time the cattle arrive at the Stoney Reserve, a lot of them have frozen feet, and ultimately 150 of them die, such that only 250 are shipped back to the Blood Reserve the following summer. And all of that at Blood Tribe's expense to move these cattle around. Of course, on the reserve too, the predicted starvation occurred, and so a lot of cattle and horses were just lost just straight to the winter starvation. And basically, you end up with a situation where the Blood Tribe's cattle numbers go down from 3,700 to 1,200. And so this is sabotage, right? This is a sabotage of the Blood Tribe's business. And, also during this heavy-handed era, I didn't mention it, but there were periods where the Blood Tribe was not allowed to use their steam engine plow. The Indian agent just said, no, you're not going to use it. I think he might have even loaned it out to some of his non-native associates. So a complete sabotage. And this is not just happening at Blood Tribe. This is happening all over Indian country as the pressure that's coming from, Duncan Campbell Scott and Arthur Meighen is put into play, is actualized. And I think it's very hard for Canadians to appreciate what kind of obstacles were put in front of First Nations communities without telling stories like this, without revisiting these histories. We're just lucky in some senses at Blood Tribe because R.N. Wilson knew English, of course, and was willing to help out, shot both sides by writing a memorandum to the federal government detailing all of this. But a lot of tribes didn't have that luxury, and so a lot of the abuses that they suffered have either been lost to history or just known through the oral tradition within the tribe and haven't been published or shared widely. So this is the kind of thing I want to put out there just to share with people as ammunition. When you hear somebody harping about how the Native people have just been dependents of the state, it's these kind of, this went on for decades and it still goes on to some extent today. Business efforts are sabotaged. Not to this extreme, but nobody's going around shooting your dogs if you don't sign away your rights. But it's still pretty bad. It's still pretty bad, and it's been tough all along for tribes to get ahead. And in the face of this, they still have. In the face of this, Blood Tribe has still been very successful at business. And the Blood Tribe funds all of its own infrastructure. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of local people think that it all is just government money. It's not. It's Blood Tribe's money, held in trust still by the government. So yeah, I wanted to share that and put that out there. I thought it's an important little piece to share around and let people know. And I look forward to. I know that there's some guys out there who are even more familiar with this history and are going to be able to provide additional details and this kind of thing. So I look forward to seeing comments and that kind of a thing. Again,